So I'm really thrilled that although this film never got nominated for an Oscar, which it should have, because Brett Morgan, the director, I mean, what an amazing job he did. It was completely incredible. I had nothing to do with it. He just made that movie, and he got immersed in it, and he persuaded Philip Glass to come in with that music. And the insect and bird sounds were done by one of the premier sound recordists of nature in the US. And so some of the journalists that I talked to in the US, they were really angry that this film wasn't nominated for an Oscar. And so one of them started calling the nominating committee, and they said, well, if it had been nominated, it would have got the Oscar. And he said, well, they said, no, the committee doesn't want that kind of film to get an Oscar. They want the kind of dark contemporary films to get an Oscar. But anyway, it did get a couple of Emmys, and Brett Morgan got his first Emmy for a director, and Hugo got the only one in history of a posthumous Emmy for his wildlife photography, and I was so happy about that. And it's so good for his son and his grandchildren to know that, he got that. So I'm just really happy and very proud of him that we could see this film. So I plan to go to sleep. I've seen it so many times. But I can't, because when I see it, those chimpanzees that you saw, I mean, a few were named, but I knew them all. Not just the ones who had names in the film, but all of them, and they were almost like my family. So, it's kind of an extraordinary film for me.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is. Thank you so much. It's honestly such a great privilege for us to have you here tonight so that we can enjoy it and share it with you. And one of the things I noticed when I watched the documentary the first time was just your extraordinary reserves of patience and curiosity and spending so much time just quietly observing. And on a personal level, I was curious as to how that has translated into other areas of your long and illustrious career, particularly in terms of waiting to see change happen on an international stage in terms of conservation.
Well, I mean, it all started when I was a tiny little girl. I spent 4 hours in a hen house waiting for a hen to come in and lay an egg, because I couldn't see a hole big enough on the hen for the egg to come out, and nobody would tell me. And a 4-year-old child spending 4 hours in a hen house is pretty amazing.
It is.
So I had the patience right then, and I used to wait for hours hoping an egg in a bird's nest would hatch and I could see the little fledgling come out, and I did once, so I had the patience as a child. I don't have patience today with what's going on the planet, the destruction of the natural world. We cannot have patience, we have to act. That's why I'm traveling now, 300 days a year around the world. There is not time to have patience, we've got to have action now, and it seems that the swing to the far right in politics and the number of presidents and prime ministers who are destroying the planet. You're very lucky, and here in New Zealand I spent an hour with your prime minister 2 days ago, and she really gets it.
Yeah.
But even for her there are constraints when it comes to big business and money and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So we've gone wrong, we've gone really, really wrong.
Yeah.
And if we don't do something about it soon, and I don't know what's going to trigger that change. The young people we work with, yes, but can we afford to wait till they're up there in those positions? I don't know.
Yeah, well, probably not, according to all the data. And that was one of the other questions that I had for you, in terms of you travel so much and you spend so much time with other people internationally. What, if any, are there countries that we should be looking to as leaders in terms of ecological conservation? Are there any countries that have really good kind of programs in place?
Well, a lot of countries have programs in place, but then a president comes along and turns the clock back. That's happened with Donald Trump for sure. He's rolled back legislation that was put in place by Roosevelt. It just, okay, you can drill for oil in this national park, and this is the big problem today. But on the other hand, as I'm traveling around, I meet so many incredible people doing amazing things. And these are my reasons for hope. It's the youth, and it's this extraordinary brain that we have. We're beginning to use it to find ways to live in greater harmony and think about our own ecological footprints. And nature, amazingly resilient. And here in New Zealand, you've got so many examples. If you go around, where were we this morning?
Zealandia.
Yes. Say it?
Zealandia.
Yes, Zealandia. Going around there and seeing that this was a place destroyed by gold mining, and now see that it's beautiful forest, and we saw so many birds in a very short time that I was able to be there. And at one time, because of the poverty of the people around Gombe, when I began in 1960, Gombe was part of the equatorial forest belt that stretched almost right across the whole of equatorial Africa to the west coast. And when I flew over in 1990, it was a tiny island of forest surrounded by completely bare hills. And it was obvious there were more people than the land could support. And people are not talking about one of the worst threats to our future, which is human overpopulation. And so it became very clear as I flew over that these people were struggling to survive, and if we didn't help them find ways of living without destroying the environment, we couldn't even try and save the chimps. Gombe would be gone. And that's what led to our program to improve their lives in the way they suggested. And now there's no more bare hills anymore. The trees have come back because the people understand that it's not just for wildlife. It's not just a bunch of arrogant white people coming in and saying, well, we want to save the chimps and therefore you have to do this, this and this. No, they've understood that it's for their own future as well, that saving the environment, the forests, we rely on. I hate calling it the services provided. That's what people say. The services the forest gives us. The forest isn't giving us services. We take them. We understand they give us clean water and air, they absorb carbon dioxide, they give out oxygen, and there's this amazing biodiversity, this extraordinary ecosystem where every little species has a role to play. And, the hope also lies in this indomitable human spirit, the people who tackle it, the impossible, or what seems impossible, and succeed.
Yeah. Can you expand a little bit more upon the idea of interconnectedness for those of us that live here in this society? Obviously, our supply chains, some of us think about them, but it's not something, because everything's so easy for us to buy and purchase, we don't think about the supply chains, ethical or not, in terms of the products that we buy and the things that we use. Can you talk a little bit more about how you see the interconnectedness of wealthy societies like ours and the rest of the planet?
Well, I think, one of the most important things for everyone to realize, whether they're rich or poor or wherever they live, is that each single one of us makes a difference every single day. And those of us who are fortunate enough to not be starving and not be struggling to get every bite of food, we have a choice as to what kind of difference we make. What do we buy? Where did it come from? Did it harm the environment when it was made? Did it lead to animals suffering like the intensive factory farms? Find out what is the impact on the environment of these cruel factory farms, destroying the habitat to grow the grain, using fossil fuel to get the grain to the animals, to the abattoir, to the table, and wasting water, changing vegetable to animal food, and then they produce in their digestion gas. We all do, right? Mm-hmm. Methane, and that's a very, very virulent greenhouse effect. So, we all can make a difference every single day. And I feel very fortunate. I mean, World War II was awful, and I was a child. But now looking back, aside from the horror of it, I'm really glad I grew up then, because everything was rationed. Coupons for food, coupons for clothes, coupons for petrol, everything. And we did not take anything for granted. We had 2 squares of chocolate a week. We had 1 egg a week. And so now children growing up today, it's not their fault if they grow up in a society like this. They take it for granted. They take it for granted they're going to have a decent meal. Although even in New Zealand, there are children living below the poverty level, which is shocking. And the UK is the worst in Europe for child poverty. And, you know, what's gone wrong with us?
Quite a lot, obviously. You mentioned in terms of hope, you have a lot of hope in the youth of today and tomorrow. Could you tell those people that may not be aware about your Roots and Shoots program?
Yeah, well, Roots and Shoots is, you saw one film in this, one shot in this movie of all those children running along that I was, you know, African children. Roots and Shoots actually began in Africa, began in Tanzania, and it began when 12 high school students came to talk to me about everything they were concerned with, like poaching in their national parks. Why wasn't the government doing something about it? Corruption, of course, but they didn't know that. And why wasn't the government doing something about the illegal dynamite fishing, where you just throw sticks of dynamite in the ocean and that stuns the fish and you just scoop them up? But it was also destroying the coral reefs and the livelihood of the local fishermen who were fishing in the old sustainable way. And they were worried about the street children who had no homes. Some of them were worried about the treatment of stray dogs. And so anyway, that led to a meeting, and we decided on this Roots and Shoots program with the main message, what I've said: every individual makes a difference every day, and we have a choice. But because of understanding the interconnectedness of everything in nature, that each group would do 3 projects, one to help people, one to help animals, one to help the environment. And that program that began with 12 high school students is now in 60 countries. It's been in more, but, you know, in a very small, a tiny little island nation. Sometimes it starts up and then the person who leads the program dies or moves or something like that. But we've planted the seeds, and that's important. And so we now have members, preschool, few, lots of kindergarten, lots of university, everything in between. And it's began in 1991, so some of our Roots and Shoots alumni, as I call them, they're now, you know, we've got the Minister of Environment in Tanzania, was in Roots and Shoots, and also in DRC, the same thing. And we have Roots and Shoots ex-members, they're now going into government, they're lawyers, they're doctors, they're teachers and they're parents. And they keep the values with them. And I think the main thing is, 1, it's animals, people, environment, not just an environmental group, but 2, the young people themselves get to choose what they do. We don't dictate. We may suggest, we may hope they join campaigns like no more single-use plastic bags and you know, marching against climate change and things. But the projects that they do, you know, I was just with a group of students from, I think it was 14, how many different schools? 15 different schools, and they were there and they were talking about the projects that they had decided to do. And I mean, there was a 13-year-old child, and she decided she was going to try and get biofuel from grass. And she'd managed a little bit, and she's got 3 more results to come in. And, you know, it's just amazing. And others are working to protect endangered species, and others are raising money for earthquake victims in Taiwan or something. So it's my biggest hope for the future. And it's growing here in New Zealand. And with JGI New Zealand, Melanie's sitting there. with a board, with staff, with volunteers.
It's fantastic, fantastic. Now I'd like to open this up to anybody else who might have a question for Dr. Goodall. You'll also have an opportunity to chat one-on-one. Obviously, don't swamp the poor women.
And let me say one more thing before you ask questions, because I've been saying this for some time. Now, here I am in Wellington, where we have weta, and I'm not talking about the insect in this case. The Lord of the Rings was made here in New Zealand. And I've been saying to people for quite some time, the Lord of the Rings is almost like a prediction of what's happening to the planet today. And, you know, I say, I'm sure most of you have read Lord of the Rings or seen the movie. And, you know, we need to grow the Fellowship of the Ring. We need millions of people joining the Fellowship of the Ring to fight the forces of Mordor, which is money and corruption and greed.
Nice. That's a perfect analogy. All right. With that, does anybody have any questions? We don't have a roving mic, so if you speak it loudly, I'll repeat it and then everyone else can hear it. Could you tell us a bit more about the spiritual experience you had in the forest one day?
It's just that when I'm in the forest, I just feel a very strong spiritual connection to the natural world, something that I believe that many indigenous people have, all the ones I've known anyway, who are still honouring their old original culture. And it's just that out in the forest, well, other places too, but for me the forest is like my home. It's where I always dreamed of being. And it's just that connection with the natural world and the absolute conviction that there is intelligence behind the universe, and the way everything is interconnected, making this amazing whole. And it's a little bit like I've become great friends with the director of the National Institutes of Health in America. And he's a geneticist. He's the one who led the team that unraveled the human genome. And he said when he began, he was an agnostic, but by the end, there was no way that he could possibly believe that the way that life is created could be an accident. So he's actually become a Christian. I just have this sense of some spiritual, something that's greater than me, and it gives me strength. So.
Thank you. That's great. Does anybody else have any questions? Yeah, right at the back. I can see you. Yeah, that's you. How did you find the courage to go on such a bold adventure?
How did I find the courage to go into what?
Such a bold adventure.
Well, I told you, I dreamed of it since I was 10. I read Tarzan of the Apes. I fell passionately in love with this glorious Lord of the Jungle. And what did Tarzan do? He flippin' well married the wrong Jane. I was really jealous. But that was when my dream began. I will go to Africa, live with wild animals. But, you know, people say, oh, Jane, you were so brave to go out in the forest. I wasn't. That was my dream. But think of Mum. She came because the British authorities wouldn't allow me alone. And she came. We have this old ex-army tent. And you have tents now, you know, they have nice sewn-in ground sheets and zips and everything. But in those days, the tent, the flap, the front was tied with tapes. And if you wanted the air to come in, which we did, you rolled up the side flaps and tied them with tapes. The ground sheet was just a piece of canvas on the floor. And of course in came the air, but also the spiders and the scorpions and the snakes. And very soon after we arrived, the baboons, who were very opportunistic, they thought, here's a good source of food for us. Chimps don't touch our food. There was, bananas were growing wild in the forest for a long time. They won't touch our food, but the baboons, oh yes, all of it they loved. And they got these big canines, And then on top of that, the people in the nearby Kigoma, they felt really concerned about Mom and me going out and not having a cook or anybody So there was a cook called Dominic who'd been to all the British houses through the town, but always got sacked because he had a predilection for cooking sherry. So they said, well, this will be perfect. We'll send Dominic with Jane and her mother, and there won't be any cooking sherry, and they'll have a great cook. Well, it took him 2 weeks to find a really potent brew made out of fermented bananas. So there's Mum left with spiders and snakes and scorpions and fierce baboons and a slightly inebriated cook. She was the brave one.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's very true.
She was, my mother was, I wouldn't be here but for her.
Yeah.
She supported my love of animals when I was a child. The one thing I got absolutely furious with Brett Morgan, the director of this film, because I had nothing to do with it. I didn't see it till it was finished. And what really made me angry, I said, you know, Brett, you put in pictures of Rusty, but he was my great teacher. He enabled me to stand up to the professors when Leakey made me go and get a PhD in Cambridge, even though I didn't have a BA. And I was nervous of the professors, and they told me, you should have given the chimps numbers, not names, and you can't talk about personality or mind or emotion, because those are unique to us. But I knew they were wrong because of my dog, Rusty. So in America, they've made a toy Rusty, and I'm about to send it to Brett, because every time I see him, I say, Brett, I'll never forgive you for not mentioning Rusty.
That's lovely, thank you. All right, over there. Have you ever thought of studying the bonobo?
No, and you know something, I don't know if you all know about the bonobo. They used to be called pygmy chimpanzees. They're actually a different species completely. Actually, it was me that said that. Yeah. Their behavior's very different, although their genetic composition is very close to ours, just like the chimp. But they have the females. We mentioned in this movie that the female chimp gets a genital swelling when she's in estrus. But that's only, not that often. But the female bonobos have it all the time, except when they're the last stages of pregnancy and the first stages of lactation. And the females, when they want to reassure each other, they do what's called Gigi rubbing, that's genital rubbing. They turn back to back with these large swellings and rub up and down on each other. And if Leakey had sent me to study bonobo, the Geographic would never have got involved. In fact, the first article, or maybe the second, I can't remember, back in 1960s, from the Geographic, there was this wonderful photograph of 4 males, and they were all very excited, and they all had penile erections. And when in those days there were graphic artists, there was no photoshopping or anything. So I got the rough print back to make comments on. And with this row of 4 male chimps, around the genital area there were circles and a message, blend into fur. And there's a very lovely picture of me standing under a tree, and I'm using a walkie-talkie to tell Mum that I'm going to be up with the chimps. And around each of my nails there's a little circle saying, remove dirt from nails.
Nice.
So that's how we've changed since then.
Yeah.
But anyway, the Geographic would not, there's no way we couldn't have made a film about bonobos.
Yeah.
Not back then.
Yeah, maybe now.
I mean, in the Geographic films, you don't see any of the mating that was pulled out of the archives.
Yeah. Better not study real life. All right, who else has a question before we head through? We've got 2 here, so I'm going to take yours first and then you. All right, thank you.
I'd really like to know what your thoughts are on zoos and keeping animals like chimps and tigers and lions in captivity in places like Wellington, and if zoos have a place in this day and age.
All right, she would like to hear your opinions around zoos and whether zoos and keeping animals in captivity have a place in this day and age.
I'm always being asked about zoos. There are zoos and zoos. What I can say is that since I first went to a zoo at London Zoo. Zoos have changed so much. The good zoos are doing a lot of conservation work. They have a lot of education programs. I know so many people who are out there doing conservation or science whose first introduction to animals was in a zoo. I know so many people who say they went to a zoo and it was looking into the eyes of an animal that changed the whole way they thought about animals. So the good zoos today have, big environments for the animals. They have people who understand the needs of the particular animal. And the most important thing is enrichment, something that I tried to begin in 1962, and it wasn't accepted because the keeper said it was too much trouble. I made a little artificial termite mound that you filled with honey and the chimps could, because they had nothing to do. And so anyway, now enrichment is part of the program of every single good zoo. And there's a fallacy about, of course, if everything was perfect, animals should be in the wild. But I'm thinking of chimpanzees now. And sometimes we need to really stop thinking about the political issues and everything and put ourselves in the place of the animal. So I was watching a group of chimpanzees, it was actually in Australia, where they have a really large enclosure and a big group of chimpanzees. And there were males grooming each other and females and babies playing, and it was getting towards evening. And then I'm thinking of some of the chimpanzees in many of the African countries where they yet remain, the chainsaws coming closer. They've often lost hand or foot from the wires set out by poachers. The killing of mothers to steal babies for sale. And then you say, well, if I'm a chimp, honestly and truly, where would I rather be? And most of the wild isn't a very nice place for many animals these days because of the poaching, because of the continual development, because of the logging and the mining. So for a good zoo, I think it does a great lot of good.
Thank you. Now, without further ado, I'd like to give a big round of applause to Dr. Goodall for her time this evening. Thank you.
And also, let's thank the Jane Goodall Institute New Zealand, Growing Roots and Shoots New Zealand. And I think you should stand up and wave to everybody. Yeah, that's right. See, there they are. And yeah, so.
Thank you. And if you would like to be more involved in the work of the Jane Goodall Institute, or if you'd like more information about the Roots and Shoots program, please go and find one of the people you've seen stand up this evening. And I'd also like to thank the Roxy Cinema and Coco for their sponsorship of the event tonight. So we'll be able to move out now and continue enjoying good conversation with each other. The bar is open, so drinks are available for purchase, and there's a lot of food.
I've got to add two more. May I add two more things just quickly? Do. First of all, for me, coming here because of the Lord of the Rings was really, really special. It's one of the most, for me, I read it to Grub when he was 2. He didn't understand it, but I read it because I wanted to. And so the fact that Gino is sitting here, he's come to help us, even though he's already seen the film twice before. So, Gino is my connection to the Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson, and everything that's been done in Weta. So thank you, Gino. And secondly, in Tanzania, where Roots and Shoots began, at the end of every event, the young people were saying, together we can save the world. And I said, yes, together we can, but will we? Mm-hmm. So now, all over Tanzania, the groups are saying at the end of every event, together we can, together we will. So if there's anybody in this audience who wants to help us save the world, can we do that together? Together we can. Together we will. That's no good. We've got to try it again. Come on, once more. Together we can. Together we will. Thank you.